January 1945. Cologne, Germany. Streets shattered by war, debris scattered in eerie silence hanging in the cold air. A German Tiger tank positions itself at the corner turret, swiveling slowly. The crew inside is confident this is routine. They've faced the enemy before and always emerged victorious. Across the battlefield, the American M4 Sherman approaches. At first glance, it seems like just another tank, its sides scratched and worn from months of combat. The Germans laugh, whispering among themselves, another Sherman no match for the Tiger. But as the Sherman's engine hums louder, the German crew grows quiet. Without warning, the Pershing's 90mm shell slams into the Tiger's front armor, sending a shockwave through the metal. The tank lurches. Fire bursts from the turret, and the crew inside can only brace for impact. The German crew, confident in their tank's reputation, is now paralyzed by the force of the blow. The hull creaks and groans as smoke fills the air. Water begins to flood the cockpit, the sound of oxygen burning in the metal air. There's no escape. The Tiger's formidable armor means nothing against the unexpected. Seconds later, the second German tank, positioned just down the street, tries to angle and retaliate, but it too is struck by another shot, a perfect hit. The battlefield falls silent once more. No cheers, no music, just the crackling of burning fuel and the distant rumble of further combat. This is not an accident. This is not a one-off. This is the beginning of something far larger. This sequence hooks the audience with the sudden destruction of a seemingly invincible force, setting the stage for the exploration of the myth of German tank dominance and the resilience of American military technology. By early 1945, Germany is running on empty. The lines on the Eastern Front are crumbling, the Allies are pushing from the west, and the Reichstag has already declared that victory is slipping out of reach. Fuel is scarce, the Luftwaffe is depleted, and the once feared U-boats are being hunted down with ease. But even in this bleak reality, there is still one symbol of German pride that remains unshaken: the Tiger tank. One Tiger can lock down a street, they say. One Tiger can hold back a battalion. The Germans still believe in their machines. Still, in the final months of the war, they are desperate to rely on the very tools that once gave them supremacy. But now those tools are the last of their strength, their final line of defense. The Tiger tank, the very thing that had once struck terror into the hearts of the Allies, has become their beacon of hope. Yet as they cling to this myth, the truth is beginning to seep through the cracks. The Allies are no longer the uncoordinated force they once were. The American army, bruised but relentless, has adapted. The Sherman tank, once seen as inferior, is no longer the underdog it was in 1942. The Americans are adapting, improving, learning with every engagement. Their tanks are becoming more than just vehicles of war. They are symbols of resilience, of something that cannot be broken. On the other hand, the Germans are struggling to keep pace with the Allies' industrial might. They cannot afford to lose a single Tiger, a single ace pilot, or a single U-boat. Every piece of hardware, every soldier, is a critical resource that must be preserved at all costs. While the Allies have a steady stream of replacements, the Germans are running out of options. With each passing day, their ability to maintain their grip on the battlefield slips further away. And yet the Germans still have the psychological edge. The Tiger tank, in the minds of German soldiers, is a force of nature. It is the unbreakable wall, the weapon that cannot be stopped. They are convinced that their tanks are the key to victory if they can just hold out long enough. But the Americans are moving faster now. As the winter of 1945 drags on, the pressure is mounting on both sides. The Allies are at the gates of the fatherland, and every day spent in battle is one step closer to victory. But for the Germans, each passing day is one step closer to their defeat. The myth of the Tiger is all they have left. If they cannot prove it in battle, if they cannot shatter the Allies' resolve, the war will be lost. The Americans, meanwhile, are determined to break through. The tanks they field may not have the mythic reputation of the Tiger, but they have something else: numbers, adaptability, and the ability to learn from their mistakes. They know the stakes are high. If they fail to break through the German defenses, the war could drag on for months, costing thousands more lives. If they succeed, they can bring this war to a swifter end, forcing the Germans to collapse under the weight of their own myth. In Cologne, where the last remnants of the German defense are dug in, the Americans have already begun their assault. They've seen the Tigers, they've felt their power, but they've also begun to see the cracks. Every hit they take, every Sherman that is destroyed, brings them closer to understanding how to deal with the German threat. And so the stage is set. The Germans are holding on to their final weapon, the last vestige of their pride. The Americans are fighting with everything they have left, knowing that one wrong move could cost them the war. This isn't just about tanks. This is about breaking the myth, shattering the belief that Germany's might is unstoppable. The battle for Cologne is more than just a fight for control of a city, it's the tipping point for the entire war. If the Americans can overcome the German myth of the tiger, they can change the course of history. But if the Germans can hold their ground even for a little while longer, they may yet have a chance to turn the tide. This section deepens the stakes, presenting the collapse of the German defense not just as a tactical failure, but a psychological one, illustrating the contrasting perspectives and pressures on both sides. It builds tension, setting the stage for the pivotal moments ahead. The German Tiger tank, with its thick, sloped armor, had been the scourge of Allied forces for years. Weighing in at nearly 60 tons, it was a formidable beast built to dominate the battlefield. The 88mm Kio-Gay, 36 liters, 56 gun, had a reputation that sent shivers down the spines of tank crews across Europe. At long range, the Tiger could destroy almost any Allied tank, with a single shot punching through armor like a hot knife through butter. The firepower alone made the Tiger a nightmare. Its 88mm round would rip through the front of a Sherman like a pair of scissors cutting paper. In theory, there was little that could stand against it. The American M4 Sherman, on the other hand, seemed a far cry from this titanic predator. Weighing just 30 tons with lighter armor and a smaller 75mm gun, the Sherman was often seen as a workhorse, a tank built for mass production, not to match the Tigers in direct confrontation. But in battle, things didn't always go according to the specs. The Tiger was built for open fields and long-range combat. The Sherman, by contrast, was a tank designed to fight in the thick of urban warfare, where its smaller size and speed became crucial advantages. The M4 Sherman was not without its flaws. Its thinner armor could be pierced easily by the Tiger's 88mm gun if the Germans had the chance to line up a shot. But that's where the advantage shifted. In the tight, twisted streets of Cologne, the Tiger's size became a liability. The heavy tank, with its wide profile and slow turret traverse, was ill-suited to maneuver in such an environment. When the Tiger tank fired, it was powerful, but the time it took to re-aim and fire again could be its undoing. The Sherman, in contrast, was more agile, its turret turning faster and its suspension more flexible on rough terrain. At 200 meters, the difference in firepower was clear. The Tiger's 88mm shell could hit with devastating force, but it also required precise aim to ensure a kill. The Sherman's 75mm gun, while less powerful, was far easier to aim quickly in the heat of battle. The Sherman was designed for mobility and flexibility, two characteristics that the German tank, heavy and cumbersome, could not match in close quarters. It wasn't just about firepower. The Sherman's gun was equipped with stabilizers, giving it a more stable and consistent firing platform, even when moving. The Tiger, with its heavier frame, did not have the same stability, meaning that the first shot often determined the outcome. The smaller Sherman might not have been able to destroy the Tiger in a single shot, but it didn't need to. What the Americans had learned through countless encounters was that if they could keep moving, keep repositioning, they could take advantage of the Tiger's slower reaction times. As the two tanks faced off in the heart of Cologne, the difference between their combat doctrines became clear. The Germans relied on firepower and precision, the Americans on tactics and relentless pressure. The Sherman tank crews, though often outgunned, had learned how to use their mobility and their numbers to their advantage. The key was to strike first and keep striking. The Americans, despite their losses, had the luxury of numbers and speed. The Germans, on the other hand, had only one chance to get it right before they were overwhelmed. In this urban battle, the Tiger had no room to breathe. The narrow streets, the looming buildings, and the constant shifting of targets forced the Germans to fight on the Americans' terms. The Tiger's armor, once its greatest strength, became its greatest weakness. At close range, even a 75mm shot could find a weak point in the Tiger's side or rear armor, a place where its thick plating couldn't protect it. And as the Americans learned to work together, their tactics became more refined. One tank would engage the Tiger from the front, drawing its fire, while another would move in from the side or rear. It wasn't just about the tanks, though. It was the crews inside that made the difference. German tank crews were highly trained, their tanks a symbol of Nazi pride. But even the best crews could be undone by the unrelenting pressure of constant combat. The American crews, though often green or hastily trained, learned quickly. The intensity of the fighting in the streets of Cologne sharpened their instincts. They knew they couldn't take hits like the Germans, they couldn't afford to. Every time a shot bounced off the Tiger's thick armor, they had to move and fire again. They learned to never stop attacking, never give the Tiger time to breathe, to adjust, to fight back. The German crew, on the other hand, had a more rigid mindset. Their confidence was shaken with each failed shot, to each moment of hesitation, as the Sherman's smaller, faster frame danced around them. Their sense of superiority began to crack. They had believed the Tiger was invincible. Now they were starting to see its flaws. They could still kill, still dominate, but not as easily as before. The invincible beast was beginning to show cracks. It wasn't just the Tiger. The Luftwaffe, the pride of the German Air Force, had once been the scourge of the skies. But now, with the relentless American P-51 Mustangs patrolling overhead, the Luftwaffe had to adapt or risk being wiped out entirely. Just as the German tanks were forced to adapt to new threats, so too were the pilots. No longer could they fly over enemy territory without facing the deadly high-speed P-51 escorts. The P-51's range and speed gave the Americans an edge, and German pilots were learning quickly that they couldn't afford to ignore the new threat. The same was true for the U-boats, lurking in the North Atlantic, once invisible in the dark waters but now being hunted down with greater efficiency by Allied sonar systems. The battlefield was evolving, and the Germans were being forced to face the reality that their once unshakable superiority was beginning to crack. The Allies, driven by sheer determination and the will to adapt, were turning the tide. They weren't relying solely on one weapon or one tactic. They were learning, improving, and evolving in real time. And as the battle for Cologne raged on, the difference between these two sides became starkly clear. One was fighting to preserve its past, the other to define its future. This section blends the technical specifications of the tanks and weapons with the visceral reality of combat, showing how these specs played out in the heat of battle. The shift from the Germans' reliance on firepower and the myth of invincibility to the Americans' adaptability and tactical innovation sets the stage for the changing dynamics of the war. Inside the Tiger tank, the air is thick with tension. The crew is silent, their focus absolute. The soft hum of the engine is the only sound, the low rumble reverberating through the metal hull. They have been through this before, the anticipation, the waiting, the moments leading up to the inevitable. The cold steel walls of the turret feel like a second skin, familiar, protective. Yet the quiet in the tank is not one of comfort. There's a sense of foreboding, as if they all know what's coming but refuse to speak it aloud. There, the gunner mutters, eyes narrowing through the periscope, scanning the street. He spots a Sherman moving cautiously through the debris-strewn road. The American tank is far off, but even at this distance, the crew feels the surge of adrenaline. It's just another Sherman, just another target. But the air inside the Tiger shifts, a subtle tension, like a muscle tightening before a fight. The commander's voice cuts through the silence, calm but firm. Target acquired. Load heat. The order is routine. They've done this 100 times. The gunner nods, and the loader works with practiced efficiency, sliding the massive shell into place. There's a rhythm to it, a ritual. The sound of metal clicking, the smell of oil, the weight of each movement. The Tiger's 88mm gun swivels with smooth precision. There's no rush, there's no panic, but inside the crew is bracing, each man in his role instinctively, knowing the steps before they happen. The gunner's finger hovers over the trigger, waiting for the perfect moment. He exhales slowly, eyes never leaving the sight. The seconds drag on, but the moment feels suspended in time. Outside, the American Sherman is still moving, unaware of the deadly predator in the shadows. The street is narrow, the buildings on either side closing in like a trap. The Tiger has the advantage. The shot is lined up perfectly. A fraction of a second. And then, fire. The recoil shakes the tank, the shell rips through the air, and the shot slams into the Sherman's side. For a moment, it's all they hear, just the sound of impact, the shockwave of the hit. The Tiger's crew sits frozen, waiting. The commander peers through the sighting scope, his brow furrowed in concentration. But there's no explosion, no billowing fire. The Sherman doesn't crumple. It keeps moving. The shot impossibly has missed the mark. The gunner curses under his breath. It's unheard of. The Tiger's gun never misses. The entire crew feels the shock of it, the disbelief that something they've counted on, something they've relied on for so long, could fail them. Their certainty has cracked. The moment of invincibility is gone. Damn it! The loader's voice is low, frustrated. The commander's face hardens, but his hands are steady. Prepare another round, he orders, his voice clipped, cutting through the tension like a blade. Inside the Sherman, the crew is anything but calm. The tank lurches forward as the commander grips the controls, his knuckles white from the strain. The engines hum as they push the Sherman faster through the narrow, debris-riddled streets. The shell from the Tiger had come too close. It rattled the tank, but they're still alive. They're still moving, and that's all that matters. That was too close, the driver mutters, his voice tight. Sweat beads on his forehead despite the cold. His eyes are fixed on the road ahead, but his mind is racing. They're outgunned, outmatched in almost every way, but they can't stop. Not now. Not ever. The commander glances over at his gunner. You ready? The gunner doesn't answer. He doesn't need to. His hands are already on the controls, eyes narrowed in concentration. He knows the stakes. He knows what's riding on this. The German tank's first shot was close, but it's not the end. It's just the beginning. The crew has already been through too much to back down now. They've fought through hell, survived ambushes, and watched their comrades fall, and yet here they are, in the heart of enemy territory, facing down one of the most powerful weapons ever built. The Sherman may not be perfect, but it's theirs, and they will fight for it with everything they've got. The gunner lines up the shot. He's been trained to think in split seconds, to make decisions in the heat of battle, and to trust his instincts. The world outside is nothing but a blur, just the Tiger in front of him, just the metal, and the firepower that stands between them and survival. He squeezes the trigger. The shell erupts from the barrel, punching through the air with a deafening roar. It feels like time has stopped. There's nothing but the shot and the impact. The world holds its breath as the round hits the Tiger's side, the smaller shell piercing the thinner armor on the turret. There's no immediate explosion, no grand fireball. But the German tank lurches, visibly damaged. The turret spins slowly, a moment of confusion, and then the smoke begins to billow from the Tiger's engine. Inside, the Tiger, chaos erupts. The crew had already felt the tremors of their first shot miss, but now they feel the sting of their own vulnerability. The German commander grits his teeth, his heart pounding in his chest. The air is thick with the smell of burning oil and electronics. The Tiger is wounded, but they're not out yet. Get us moving, the commander orders, his voice hoarse. The crew scrambles, pushing the tank to its limits, trying to reposition, trying to get away from the relentless Sherman. The tracks grind as the tank struggles to move, but it's too late. The damage is done. The Tiger's armor, once a symbol of invincibility, is no longer enough. For the Sherman crew, it's a fleeting moment of victory. A single shot doesn't win the battle, but it's a symbol of something greater. They can stand their ground. They can fight back. They can beat the myth. For the German crew, that same moment is a revelation. The Tiger, once a legend, is no longer the unstoppable force they believed it to be. The gap between them and the Americans has closed, and with it, their hopes of stopping the tide of war. This section contrasts the human experience within both tanks, how the German crew's reliance on their tank's dominance is shattered by the American crew's adaptability and resolve. The focus is on the personal, emotional reactions inside the tanks, showing how each side deals with the stress, the fear, and the raw reality of combat. In the final months of the war, both the Allies and the Germans were operating under different rules of engagement, shaped by different doctrines, industrial capacities, and wartime logistics. The American forces had an inherent advantage that was not immediately apparent on the battlefield: the ability to rapidly adapt, manufacture, and deploy new technologies and tactics. The Germans, by contrast, were stuck in the past, unable to shift quickly enough to counter the evolving American strategies. The American approach was shaped by sheer industrial capacity. Tanks like the M4 Sherman were not built to be the heaviest or the most powerful. They were built to be numerous, reliable, and adaptable. Mass production was the key, with hundreds of factories across the United States pumping out thousands of Shermans every month. The U.S. was able to replace lost tanks and continue fighting at a scale that the Germans could not match. The Sherman, while often outgunned, could absorb punishment, be repaired quickly, and put back into action in days, not weeks. On the other side, the Germans had the opposite problem. The Tiger tank, with its thick armor and powerful 88mm gun, was a symbol of Nazi engineering designed to intimidate and destroy. But the very qualities that made it so feared The massive weight, the complex machinery, the labor-intensive production process also made it a logistical nightmare. Each Tiger required vast resources to produce and maintain. The engines were prone to breakdowns, the armor too heavy for quick repairs, and the production lines for spare parts were slow and inefficient. Unlike the Allies, the Germans couldn't produce their tanks in large enough numbers, and each loss on the battlefield was a blow they couldn't easily recover from. The German doctrine had been built around the idea of decisive action, the belief that a few highly skilled units equipped with the best technology could win battles. The Tiger was the centerpiece of that doctrine. The tank was meant to break through enemy lines, to destroy large formations with a single overwhelming punch. But as the war dragged on, this doctrine started to break down. The Germans couldn't afford to lose their Tigers, but they were losing them in droves, and each loss was a strategic setback. The American strategy, however, was not built on a single weapon or unit. The U.S. military's doctrine was based on massed firepower, mobility, and constant pressure. Unlike the Germans, who relied on precision strikes and tank-on-tank duels, the Americans understood the value of coordination. Tank units worked alongside infantry, artillery, and air support. The Sherman tank was just one part of a larger integrated battle plan that sought to keep the enemy off balance and under constant attack. It wasn't about winning a single fight. It was about wearing down the enemy over time, using their own vulnerabilities against them. The logistical systems of the U.S. military ensured that this strategy could be sustained. The Allies had perfected the art of rapid mobilization and resupply. Convoys, train lines, and airlifts brought supplies to the front lines, ensuring that the tanks, soldiers, and supplies kept moving. The Red Ball Express, a network of truck convoys, running supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines, kept the Allied forces fueled and equipped. The Germans, however, were operating in a world of shortages. The Luftwaffe's raids on supply lines had taken their toll. Fuel shortages plagued the Wehrmacht, and their ability to replace tanks and equipment was diminishing with each passing day. In the midst of this imbalance, decisions were being made at the highest levels. The German High Command was locked in a rigid mindset. Despite the mounting evidence that their previous strategies were failing, the German leadership doubled down on the Tiger tank, the Luftwaffe, and their defensive positions. They had committed to the idea of technological superiority, believing that the key to victory lay in a few decisive engagements in a tank that could withstand anything the Allies could throw at it. But the American military, backed by its vast industrial resources, adapted quickly. The design of the Sherman evolved with the demands of the battlefield. Newer models were equipped with better guns, more reliable engines, and improved armor. In contrast, the German military struggled to keep their tanks running at full capacity. The longer they relied on their existing strategies and weaponry, the more outdated they became. When a German tank was destroyed, it was a heavy blow, not just to the crew, but to the industrial machine behind it. Rebuilding the Tiger took time that the Germans didn't have. As the Americans rolled forward, they weren't just relying on their tanks. They had learned to fight with coordination and to adapt to the challenges of every battlefield. Their artillery, air superiority, and infantry worked in harmony to put the Germans on the defensive. Meanwhile, the Germans could not afford to risk their precious Tigers in large numbers. They couldn't afford to waste them in a battle of attrition. Their best and brightest commanders, trained for offensive action, were forced into a defensive stance, a situation that went against everything they had been taught. This difference in doctrine was not just tactical, it was cultural. The Americans, with their vast resources, could afford to take risks, to throw large numbers of relatively inexpensive tanks into battle, knowing that the loss of a few wouldn't change the course of the war. The Germans, however, had to protect their precious Tigers at all costs, knowing that losing them would not just cost them a tank, but potentially a strategic advantage that they could not afford to lose. The fear of failure paralyzed them, while the Americans were emboldened by their industrial might and flexibility. This was the essence of the two military systems, the Germans clinging to outdated doctrines and technologies that could no longer sustain them, and the Americans who, despite the odds, had learned to fight smarter, faster, and with relentless pressure. The battle for Cologne was not just a fight for a city, it was the culmination of years of military philosophy, of decisions made under pressure, and of contrasting visions for how to win a war. This section delves into the doctrinal differences, logistical realities, and decision-making processes that defined the military strategies of both sides. It highlights the contrast between German reliance on heavy, costly units like the Tiger and the American ability to produce and deploy mass quantities of adaptable, efficient tanks, shaping the outcome of the battle. The Tiger tank had long been a symbol of German supremacy on the battlefield. Its 88 mm cannon-thick armor and imposing presence had struck fear into the hearts of Allied soldiers from the moment it first appeared in combat. For years, it had been the centerpiece of German tank doctrine, a juggernaut capable of decimating entire platoons, its reputation unchallenged. But in the streets of Cologne, that myth began to unravel. The first shot from the Sherman had been a wake-up call, a jarring moment where the invincibility of the Tiger was called into question. The crew had seen it before numerous times, but never like this. The shot should have bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's thick frontal armor. Instead, it had pierced the side armor, sending the crew scrambling. It wasn't just the mechanical damage that hit hardest, it was the mental shock. The German tank crews had been conditioned to believe that nothing could stand against their Tigers. They had always expected to dominate. But now, something had changed. Inside the Tiger, the air was thick with frustration and disbelief. The commander cursed his grip, tightening on the turret controls. "What the hell happened?" he muttered, staring out through the sights. The Sherman had been knocked back, but it hadn't been destroyed. The sound of fire echoed in his ears as the Tiger's turret slowly swiveled to find a new target. But something inside the crew had already shifted. They were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. The second shot, another hit, only confirmed the worst fears of the German crew. This time, there was no mistaking it. The hit was solid, direct, and devastating. The fire in the Tiger's turret spread quickly, smoke billowing from the engine compartment. The German tank lurched to a halt, immobilized, its reputation of invincibility finally shattered. Outside, the American crew, still reeling from the first shot, watched in disbelief as the German tank faltered. They had always known that the Tiger was the ultimate threat on the battlefield, but seeing it vulnerable, seeing it falter, was an entirely different experience. For the first time in the war, the Sherman, often seen as inferior, had the upper hand. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough. The psychological shift on both sides was palpable. For the Germans, the myth of the Tiger's dominance was no longer unchallenged. They could no longer rely on the belief that their tank was invincible, that it could simply crush the enemy beneath its weight. The reality of the battle, the vulnerability of their tanks, was now unavoidable. The German crews knew it too. The hesitation was clear in their actions as they attempted to reposition. There was no longer that calm confidence, no longer that unshakable belief in their superiority. The fear, however subtle, had crept in. For the first time, they questioned their own invulnerability. "We're not untouchable," one of the German tank commanders muttered, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. The silence inside the tank had become unbearable, a sharp contrast to the earlier noise of combat. The myth had broken, and with it, their sense of purpose. For years, they had been the monsters of the battlefield, the fearsome force that struck fear into the hearts of every Allied soldier. But now they were just men, their machines, just machines, vulnerable and fallible. On the American side, the shift was no less significant. The Sherman, while never a match for the Tiger in raw firepower or armor, had just proven its worth. It was not about being the biggest or the strongest. It was about adaptability, coordination, and taking advantage of every opportunity. The Sherman crew had always known that their tank wasn't invincible. They had always known they couldn't rely on sheer power alone. But now they knew something more important, that they didn't have to. The tactical evolution was clear. The Americans had long since stopped trying to engage the Tiger on its terms. They had learned that taking the fight to the Germans using their mobility was their best weapon. The Sherman's ability to move quickly, its smaller profile, and its more versatile firepower meant that it could find the weak spots in the German tanks that had once seemed impervious. It wasn't the Sherman's armor or gun that had won the battle, it was the way the Americans had fought, the way they had adapted and pressured the Germans into mistakes. And it wasn't just the tanks. The battle for Cologne was the culmination of a larger shift in the war. The myth of German superiority, whether it was the Tiger tank, the U-boat, or the Luftwaffe, had been built on a foundation of fear and technological edge. But as the war dragged on, the Allies had adapted. The U.S. had grown stronger, more agile, and more relentless. The Germans, once masters of technological innovation, found themselves unable to keep pace with the industrial might and strategic flexibility of their opponents. In the aftermath of the battle, the German High Command took stock of the situation. The once feared Tiger tank had been relegated to just another casualty of war. The myth had collapsed, and with it the Germans' last hope of holding off the Allies. They could no longer rely on their technological edge. The Tiger had been beaten by a tank that they had once considered inferior. The symbolism was not lost on the German officers. Their last line of defense had been broken, and they had no answer for the new realities of modern warfare. For the Americans, the victory was a moment of realization. It was not just about defeating the Tiger, it was about defeating the myth. The psychological warfare that had once defined the German approach had now shifted in favor of the Allies. The Tiger no longer represented the unstoppable force it once had. It was just another target, another challenge to be overcome. The battle for Cologne marked the end of the German tank myth, and with it the beginning of the end for the Wehrmacht. The collapse of the Tiger myth echoed through the remaining months of the war. The Germans, now aware of their vulnerability, could not stop the tide of Allied progress. The psychological shift had been as important as the tactical and strategic victories. For the first time in the war, the Allies had broken the myth that Germany's best weapons were unbeatable, and with that, the foundation of the Nazi war machine cracked. This section portrays the emotional and psychological collapse of the German tank myth and the profound impact it had on both sides. It highlights how the shift from invincibility to vulnerability reverberated throughout the German ranks, and how the Allies adapted to take advantage of this new reality. The collapse of the myth was not just a tactical defeat, it was a psychological turning point that shaped the outcome of the war. In the days following the battle for Cologne, the impact of the destruction of the Tiger tank became clear. The immediate consequences were tactical. German forces were forced to withdraw from urban strongholds, and the Allies made significant gains, pushing deeper into German territory. The psychological toll, however, was even greater. For the Germans, the myth of their technological superiority had been shattered, and with it any hope of halting the Allied advance. For the Americans, the destruction of a feared adversary was a significant moral victory, but it was also a realization the road to victory would require more than just the destruction of a single tank. The immediate aftermath for the German tank crews was filled with frustration and disbelief. The once invincible Tiger, which had been the backbone of their armored forces, was now just another casualty of the war. Each Tiger lost on the battlefield represented not just a loss of men and machines, but a loss of confidence in the very system that had defined their warfare strategy. The Germans could no longer afford to be as selective in their tank engagements. They couldn't afford to send out precious Tigers without a guaranteed outcome. And with every Tiger lost, the hope of turning the tide seemed to slip further away. For the Allies, the destruction of the Tiger was a momentous occasion. It wasn't just the physical destruction of a tank, it was the collapse of an idea. The Germans had relied on the power of the Tiger to strike fear into their enemies. But once that myth was broken, the psychological advantage shifted. The American and Allied soldiers who had fought under the shadow of German technological dominance for so long now saw the Tiger not as an unstoppable force, but as a machine that could be beaten. The effect of this realization was profound. The defeat of the Tiger marked a turning point, not just on the battlefield, but in the collective psyche of the Allied forces. In the months that followed, the effects of this shift reverberated across the European theater. As German tank divisions dwindled in number and effectiveness, the Allies were able to exploit weaknesses they had once been afraid to challenge. The Shermans, once seen as inferior, were now emboldened by the realization that they could face the best that Germany had to offer and win. But more than that, the myth of the Tiger tank had fallen, and with it, a piece of the psychological warfare that had sustained the German war effort. On the German side, however, the consequences were grimmer. The loss of the Tiger's psychological edge meant that German forces were no longer fighting with the same fervor or confidence. The German leadership, still clinging to the idea that the war could be turned around, had no answer to this loss. The fear that had once gripped the hearts of Allied soldiers was now felt by the German tank crews. They were no longer invincible, and they knew it. The legend of the Tiger tank, which had once stood as a symbol of German might, was now just a painful reminder of what they had lost. This moment, when the Tiger tank, once a monster of the battlefield, was shown to be vulnerable, marks a shift in the war. It was no longer just a conflict of technology and firepower, it was a war of wills. The Germans, despite their technological advantages, were no longer able to intimidate. The Allies, emboldened by their victory, began to press forward with renewed vigor, no longer shackled by the fear of the German machine. The long-term consequences for the German military were profound. Not only had they lost a strategic advantage, but the collapse of the tiger myth symbolized a larger systemic failure. The inability to adapt to overcome the industrial and tactical might of the Allies sealed Germany's fate. The Allies had learned to fight together, to adapt quickly, and to wear down their opponents with relentless pressure. The Germans, however, remained locked in outdated doctrines, unable to break free from their reliance on a few superior units. In the years after the war, the story of the Tiger tank continued to captivate military historians and enthusiasts. It remained a symbol of the war's technological arms race, a symbol of both the Germans' initial triumph and their eventual downfall. But the collapse of the Tiger's myth had larger implications. It was a lesson in overconfidence, in the danger of relying too heavily on one weapon or one idea. The Germans had believed their technology would carry them to victory, but it was their inability to adapt that led to their defeat. For the Allies, the defeat of the Tiger tank became a cornerstone of their post-war legacy. The lessons learned from the battlefields of Europe would shape military doctrine for decades to come. It was no longer enough to have superior technology. The true strength lay in the ability to adapt, to learn from each engagement, and to leverage resources in ways that the enemy could not. As historians look back on the battle for Cologne and the destruction of the Tiger tank, the question arises, what if the Allies had not adapted so quickly? What if the myth of the Tiger had not been broken? Would the war have lasted longer? Would Germany have had a chance to regroup and recover from their losses? The defeat of the Tiger tank may have been just one battle in a larger war, but its symbolic power cannot be overstated. The Allies' ability to dismantle the myth of invincibility and replace it with a determination to fight through any obstacle was a turning point in the war. As we look forward to the next chapter in this story, the question remains, what other myths built on fear and technological superiority would the Allies have to face? And how would they continue to challenge the seemingly unbreakable? This section reflects on the long-term consequences of the collapse of the Tiger tank myth, both tactically and psychologically, while tying in the lasting legacy of this shift for both the German and Allied forces. The closing questions provide an opening for future discussions, engaging the audience to think critically about how myths and technological superiority affect the course of warfare and history.